The crystal glass hit the first-class lounge floor and shattered into 3 pieces, not because someone dropped it, but because the server stood frozen eyes locked on the man who had just walked through the automatic glass doors. No one else in the lounge noticed anything unusual, but the server did. He had seen that face on financial magazines, on tech news panels, on stages where the most powerful CEOs in America stood side by side. "No way," he whispered, as his heart kicked once in his chest. Ethan Reeves, the man Silicon Valley called the game changer, had just walked into the first-class lounge, looking like a freshman who had rolled out of bed after an all-nighter. No suit, no diamond watch, no security detail. Just a faded, silver-grey hoodie, worn enough to make any airport guard think he had wandered into the wrong area. He looked ordinary, too. Ordinary. And that made everything feel wrong. The lounge continued moving like its own quiet luxury universe. Silver spoons tapped porcelain cups. Oxford shoes pressed into thick wool carpet murmurs about initial public offerings, real estate markets, and cryptocurrency drifted through the air. White light reflected off faces that held the calm confidence of people who believed the world belonged to them. But Ethan did not belong to their conversations, or to the walnut tables and leather chairs priced like used cars. He did not belong to the glances that measured worth by clothing and brand labels. He sat in the farthest corner where the lights were softer, where no one bothered to look. To them, he was just another business traveler, maybe a programmer, or someone lucky enough to get a last-minute upgrade. No one knew the backpack at his feet carried the blueprint that could reshape the future of global augmented reality. The deal with Westalion in Geneva was not just an opportunity. It was a lifeline for hundreds of people, the result of thousands of silent working hours and a fight for survival he had prepared for over 2 years. He opened his laptop and scrolled to slide 31, the one where Nova Sight's growth curve climbed like a crooked hill, imperfect but determined. One more deal, one more handshake in Geneva, and everything would change. A notification lit up, "Is Geneva ready? We believe in you." Ethan squinted and typed back, "Preparing now. Don't worry." But he knew the truth. The more people believed in you, the heavier the pressure became. And this pressure was not from the deal. It was from his own history, the parts no one knew. The years he ran across 3 neighborhoods, just to reach the library before closing the nights. His mother, a middle school teacher, graded papers under a warm desk lamp, while he wrote his first lines of code on the floor. The afternoons his father, a mechanic, dipped his hands in engine grease and showed him that everything had structure. Everything had reason, and mistakes always began with people who thought they could never be wrong. His parents taught him to read the world with patient eyes, and that was why he didn't get angry when judged. He observed, and he remembered. Not far away, a group of businessmen clinked glasses. "We run this market," one middle-aged man laughed, chest-puffed with pride. Ethan glanced over, then returned to his keyboard. He didn't care. Real power was not the laughter in a first-class lounge. It was the decisions that shook markets without anyone watching. He worked quietly, his calm not indifference, but the armor of someone who knew the world could turn against him at any second. Outside the large glass window, airplanes lined up like steel beasts resting before their next migration. The Los Angeles sky was clear, the breeze light sunlight glinting off silver fuselages. Everything looked peaceful, as if nothing could go wrong. But Ethan's stomach tightened, that feeling he only had when instinct whispered a warning. He inhaled, trying to push it aside. Maybe it was pre-deal anxiety, maybe he was too used to waiting for something bad to happen. but his instincts had never been wrong. The announcement echoed through the lounge. Bayesian Air Flight Bravo. X-ray 914 to Geneva is now boarding. First-class passengers may proceed. Ethan closed his laptop slung on his backpack and stood. A man in a suit beside him frowned as Ethan walked past, as if someone wearing a hoodie polluted the air of luxury. Ethan didn't react. The only eyes that followed him were the server's, the one who had dropped the glass. That look was not insult. It was recognition, the recognition of someone who had only seen Ethan through a screen. Ethan gave him a small nod, just enough for the server to know he was right. Ethan stepped into the jet bridge where the warm yellow lights stretched ahead like a tunnel toward a future he could not predict. Each footstep echoed on the metal floor like a clock ticking on a wooden desk, slow, steady. A nameless fear slipped into his chest, but he did not stop. He could not stop. Ahead of him was the door to the first-class cabin behind him, an entire company waiting for him, and somewhere between those 2 points was who he really was, a man underestimated his whole life, but never broken. When Ethan set foot on the plane, the story paused for a beat, as if the narrator wanted to hold the moment still. Because only Ethan did not know that this flight would not just determine the outcome of the Geneva deal. It would open another battle, one that had nothing to do with technology, finance, or strategy, but with dignity, truth power, and the cost of misjudging a person based solely on the clothes they wear. Ethan took one more step and fate began to move, slow, quiet, but irreversible. The first-class cabin of flight, Bravo X-ray 914, glowed under warm golden lights as Ethan stepped inside like a luxury film set where every detail had been arranged with meticulous care cream leather seats that reclined into beds, a sparkling minibar, and a faint hint of lavender drifting from the ventilation system. It all created a peace so perfect it felt artificial, the kind of peace only people with money could afford to waste. But the moment Ethan entered, that peace was sliced apart by a sharp, icy stare. Lindsay Carter stood in the aisle like a sculpture, carved with precision. Her blonde bob was ironed pinned straight, her red lipstick smooth as caramel glaze, her fitted uniform crisp as if it had just been steamed. In her hand was a tray of hot towels, but there was no warmth in her eyes. She looked at Ethan as though he had walked into the wrong world, not just the wrong cabin. A cold, cutting look full of questions. "What are you doing here?" Ethan felt it in less than half a second, just like 100 times before he saw the judgment flick across her cheek, a quick, refined glance, but filled with enough bias to make him want to sigh. Some people knew how to hide their emotions. Lindsay was not one of them. She stepped forward, forcing a smile that stretched across her face, like skin being pulled tight only because the job required it. "Can I help you, sir?" Her voice was sweet enough to replace syrup, but the aftertaste was unmistakably sour. Ethan replied in a calm breath of a tone. "I am fine, thank you." He took one step toward seat 1 Alpha. Lindsay did not move. Her eyes pale blue, like early spring ice, dropped to the grey hoodie he was wearing. A glance short enough to avoid being called rude, but long enough to send the message, "You do not belong here." Ethan was used to it. But today, with the pressure of Geneva tightening around his chest, that tiny gesture scraped across an old scar, tearing it open again. Sir Lindsay continued, lowering her voice to a near whisper, but unable to hide the suspicion underneath, "This is the first-class cabin." Ethan pointed to 1 Alpha, glowing on the small digital screen beside the seat. "I know. That is my seat." The words made her lips freeze, her smile cracking like paint under harsh sun. She had clearly not expected that answer. She blinked once, as if checking she had not misheard. "Are you sure?" A simple question, but wrapped in a world of contempt disguised as courtesy. Not "May I see your ticket?" Not "Perhaps I made a mistake." Instead, "Are you sure?" as if Ethan were trying to sneak into a space meant for a different class of people. Ethan did not look at her again. He simply lifted his phone slightly, bringing the electronic ticket closer so she could see it. Lindsay gave it a quick glance, but instead of verifying it properly, she only looked long enough to read one alpha, then stretched her smile again. It was not a smile of acknowledgement. It was the smile of someone thinking the system must have made an error. "Would you like a pre-flight drink?" she asked, but the politeness in her tone was now mechanical, the kind produced by a robot programmed to smile on cue. "Water, thank you," Ethan answered. Lindsay raised one eyebrow as if he had just broken an unspoken rule. In her mind, first-class passengers ordered champagne or at least pulp-free juice, and he chose water, a choice so ordinary she found it irritating. Ethan settled into the seat, feeling the leather soften beneath him. Seat 1 Alpha was the kind usually occupied by bank executives, investors, or celebrities. The irony was that he, a man who built technology used by millions, was still seen as someone who didn't belong here. There were moments in his life when he believed that if he traded his hoodie for a $5,000 suit, if he replaced his sneakers with polished Oxford shoes, everything would be easier. But then he remembered his father, always in his old mechanic overalls hands, stained with grease, yet never bowing to anyone. "You do not dress for respect," his father once told him, hand on his shoulder. "You live in a way that makes people respect you, no matter what you wear." Ethan lived by that. But the world was not always ready to understand. While Lindsay went to get his water, Ethan opened his phone and reviewed the Geneva schedule. Every note on the screen felt like a small stone, growing heavier by the minute. The meeting at 10, the presentation at 11, the negotiation at 12. If he arrived late, everything would fall apart. Everything. And everyone was depending on this flight, depending on him. Lindsay returned and placed the glass of water on the table with a light but pointed force that made the ice clink against the glass in 2 sharp taps. She did not meet his eyes. She did not smile. She asked nothing more. She headed straight toward the back of the cabin, where several passengers were hanging Armani and Balmain coats. Ethan heard laughter conversations about luxury vacations, requests for expensive wine, all of it blending into the familiar soundtrack of first class. Yet in the middle of it, he felt like an outsider in a showroom where everything was displayed to impress, and he had nothing to display except his mind. And in many eyes that meant nothing compared to a suit. Ethan tried to focus on his presentation, scrolling through data simulations charts he had revised dozens of times. But Lindsay's earlier look lingered like a small thorn, brushing against a nerve, keeping him from relaxing. He exhaled, placing a hand on his chest to feel the steady beat, trying to calm the uneasy swell rising inside him. He told himself, "It is a small thing, not worth thinking about." But deep down, he knew that was not true. Bias, even when small, was kindling, and with the right person, the right moment, the right tension, it could burn down a forest. To his left, an older man settling into seat 2. Charlie glanced at Ethan, the look quick like a match strike. 1 second was enough to judge his entire existence. The man leaned toward his wife and muttered, "Another kid lucky enough to get an upgrade." His voice was not quiet enough to escape Ethan's ears, but Ethan said nothing. He had heard that line 1,000 times. Minutes later, first class continued to fill. Rimowa suitcases clicked open, expensive perfumes drifted through the air. Lindsay moved back and forth smoothly, like a well-tuned machine, but every time she passed Ethan, she shot a quick look, as if waiting for him to make a mistake that would confirm her instinct that he was not the right kind of passenger. Ethan closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. He did not know, and could not know, that those small looks and small gestures were the very first stones on the path toward the worst storm of his life. Some storms begin with thunder, but some begin with a single look. Just one look. And Ethan had just received it. The first-class cabin of Bravo X-ray 914 was nearly full when heavy footsteps echoed from the aircraft door, thudding like a drum, announcing the arrival of someone who had long been protected by privilege. Lindsay's entire expression shifted instantly from irritated tension to the kind of eager politeness she reserved only for those she believed were worth serving. She straightened her back, curved her lips into the airline's approved smile, and her eyes brightened the moment she recognized the man stepping in. Richard Bowman. 67 years old, silver hair combed as smoothly as expensive silk navy blazer embroidered with the crest of an elite golf club and a trail of warm, woody cologne that reached the cabin before he did. Richard did not walk into first class, he entered, as if this wasn't a commercial airliner, but a family asset passed down through generations. And in his mind, that was exactly true, because this cabin belonged to him. He stopped and scanned the room from left to right, like a homeowner inspecting who had dared to sit on his living room sofa. Then his eyes landed on Ethan. 1 second. 1 second was enough for Richard's expression to shift from neutral to annoyed, then to outright offended. He approached like a cold wind, not even glancing at Ethan, but speaking directly to Lindsay, his voice louder than necessary. "Lindsay, darling, we have a very big problem here." Everyone nearby heard it. Lindsay's eyes lit up as if the universe had finally handed her the perfect moment. She turned to Ethan, her earlier smile vanishing instantly. Her voice dropped into that cold tone anyone wearing a hoodie knew all too well. "Mr. Bowman wants seat 1 Alpha, she said, as if this were an undeniable law of nature. Richard crossed his arms and tilted his head with arrogant certainty. "You know this, Lindsay. For 10 years I have sat in 1 Alpha on every Bravo X-ray 914 flight to Geneva. My name might as well be engraved on that seat." Lindsay nodded hard, as if this claim were sacred. She faced Ethan again. "Sir, there seems to be an issue in the system. Please stand so we can arrange another seat for you. No apology. No, may I see your ticket?" She assumed the system was wrong, and she assumed he was the mistake. Ethan looked up, his eyes steady, impossibly calm. "This is my seat," he said, his tone not raised, not lowered, simply clear and solid like steel. Richard let out a full laugh, the kind of laugh belonging to someone who believed power was something he wore like jewelry. "Young man, do not make this difficult. Just stand. This seat has been mine since long before you even knew what flying was." Ethan looked straight at him, not confrontational, not defensive, just factual. "I paid for this seat. I arrived on time. And I am sitting exactly where I should." A moment of silence dropped over the cabin like a brick, a moment heavy enough for bias to ignite. Lindsay tightened her grip on the tray of hot towels until her fingers turned pale. When she spoke again, her voice sliced through the air like cold metal. "Sir, you cannot sit here. This is our platinum tier passenger." Ethan caught the meaning instantly. Not just platinum, not just a regular customer, but a white man from the class they were used to serving. And he, a man of color in a hoodie, did not fit their definition of first class. A soft, clicking sound came from the row behind him. A blonde woman murmured to her husband, "I knew it. This type always causes trouble." The quiet words hit Ethan like a knife in the back. Still, he kept his voice steady, perfectly even. "I am willing to show you the ticket again." "But I will not leave my seat." Lindsay drew a long breath, as if she had been waiting exactly for that answer to create her dramatic moment. "Then I will have to alert the captain." She turned and strode toward the cockpit, her heels striking the floor in cold, sharp taps, like the pounding of a judge's gavel. Inside the cabin, the air thickened. Richard smirked triumphantly, pulling his seat slightly back, preparing to reclaim his place. He looked at Ethan the way an adult looks at a child refusing to move from a swing at the playground. Ethan exhaled softly, so quietly, only he could hear it. He did not want this to escalate. He did not want attention. He did not want anyone to know who he was. But he understood perfectly where he was. And he understood the weight of the eyes pressed onto him. He had faced them all his life. The cockpit door opened with a sharp click. Captain Howard Briggs stepped out, silver hair at his temples, shoulders square, the expression of someone who believed he was always right. Men like him did not need to raise their voice. They controlled the room simply by looking at people. "What is going on here?" he asked, though it was not a question. "It was the command who is causing trouble." Lindsay pointed at Ethan. "This passenger is in the wrong seat and refuses to move." Richard added his voice, thick with superiority. "I booked one Alpha as I always do. He must have the wrong ticket or a mistaken upgrade." Captain Briggs turned to Ethan and with a single glance made his judgment. No questions, no checking the ticket, no need for evidence. He saw a young man, a man in a hoodie. A man who did not fit first class. "Sir," he said sharply, curtly, "you need to gather your belongings and move to a seat in the back immediately. We need to depart on time." Ethan slowly raised his phone, opened the ticket, and held it up. "This is my ticket. My booking code. My seat." Captain Briggs did not even look. "We do not argue on the aircraft. You have two options: move or be removed from the plane. Is that clear?" Richard smiled. Lindsay released a satisfied breath. Several passengers lowered their heads, pretending not to hear, though their eyes peeked through their fingers. Ethan felt a coldness crawl down his spine. Not fear. Disappointment. Because even though he dressed differently, even though he did not look like first class, he still expected, he hoped that people would be fair. He had been wrong. He looked into the captain's eyes, and for a moment his calm wavered. He could stay and fight. But he knew what would happen. They would call security. He would be dragged off in front of everyone. He would miss Geneva. His entire company would collapse. He could not allow that. Ethan stood. Not because they were right, but because he could not sacrifice everything just to win a small, humiliating battle. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to lose control, waiting for him to fulfill their stereotype. But he did not. Ethan spoke only one sentence, soft as a whisper, but enough to make Lindsay freeze. "I will not forget this." Then he grabbed his backpack and walked past Richard, who smirked like a man convinced he had won a game, only he knew the rules to. Ethan moved toward the back of the cabin, toward the cramped seats, the crying children, the smell of reheated food. Every step pressed against a piece of his dignity. Every step reminded him of the hundreds of times he had been misjudged. Every step pushed him lower. But no one knew that the deeper they pushed him, the stronger the force would be when he rose. Ethan settled into seat, 32, bravo, tight, warm, and suffocating. He placed his backpack at his feet and rested his head against the wall. And in the moment when everyone believed he had lost, a small, quiet smile formed at the corner of his lips. Not because he was happy, but because he had seen their weakness. A fatal one. The weakness of people who believed power belonged only to those who sat in seat 1 Alpha. They did not know that today they had pushed the wrong person, and the price they would pay would be far greater than a seat. Ethan sank into seat 32 Bravo with the heavy silence of a man who had just been pushed out of the room he had paid to enter. The seat was narrow stiff, and shaped with so little space between the armrests that it seemed designed to remind passengers this place was not made for comfort. To his left, a student with oversized headphones drifted in and out of sleep, his head bobbing like a leaf caught in the wind. To his right, a woman tried to soothe her red-faced newborn, her trembling hands showing exhaustion and stress. The baby's cries, the sound of pages turning, the crinkle of plastic bags and orders being shouted across the economy cabin, blended into a chaotic symphony, one that had nothing to do with the $100 wine glasses clinking in the front, where seat 1 Alpha now waited for Richard Bowman to recline with pride. Ethan closed his eyes. He wasn't angry the way people might assume. What rose in his chest wasn't rage. It was a bitter kind of silence, like molten lava flowing quietly beneath the surface. No one could see it. No one could hear it. But its heat was enough to burn down a forest if anyone stepped on it. He felt the eyes of other passengers, glances stolen through half-lidded looks, the eyes of people who knew what had happened in first class, but chose to stay silent. Some looked sympathetic, some looked uncomfortable, and a few looked satisfied, as if they had just watched the universe restore what they believed was the correct order. Ethan didn't need to look to know those expressions. He had seen them throughout his childhood, his school years, his career even after becoming the CEO of a billion-dollar company. They were always the same, quiet, cold, sharp as a razor blade. In that moment, Ethan wanted to laugh, not because economy class was funny, but because life had a way of testing him with scenarios so familiar they felt scripted, and the pain still landed in all the right places. If they knew who I was, he thought. Then he answered himself no. They don't need to know, because he had never been the kind of man who used his title as a weapon. If people respected him, it had to be because of who he truly was, not because of the word CEO. A loud pop echoed from fourth class, the sharp sound of a champagne cork being released. It was followed by Richard's showy laughter. Ethan opened his eyes, listening to the clear ring of glasses. Each sound pressed harder against the bruise forming inside him. But he didn't collapse into self-pity. He didn't hate them. He simply noted it. And remembered. As the plane began taxiing, the engines roared, vibrations crawling through the metal frame and into Ethan's armrest. The late afternoon sunlight swept through the window, casting shadows across his face like carved lines. He leaned his head against the wall, staring into the fading sky. In that rare moment of quiet, he remembered his mother. He remembered her calloused hands, holding a book out to him. Ethan, you may not be like them, but you can still go farther than they ever will. She once told him, her voice soft as wind, yet strong as an ancient tree. Those words had stayed with him for years, but today they meant something different. You may not be like them, but you can make them pay for underestimating you. Once the plane leveled off, the seatbelt sign clicked off. Ethan opened his eyes, took a slow breath, and pulled his backpack onto his lap. He unzipped it and removed a thin black laptop, a small tool, but sharper than any blade, a weapon he had never intended to use against anyone. But today he understood he no longer had a choice. Not because he wanted revenge, but because he needed fairness, and because some lessons had to be delivered through decisions no one could ignore. He opened the laptop, the screen glowing in the dimming cabin lights. System logs scrolled across the display, familiar and steady, like the breathing of an old friend. Ethan opened his email app. His fingers moved slowly, but each keystroke was firm and exact, like tapping into the heart of a machine he knew better than anyone. He typed the first line, to daniel.cross@bayesianair.com. The CEO of the airline, a man Ethan had met once at a conference 3 years earlier, a man who had invited him to collaborate on a corporate travel partnership, a man with more power than Captain Briggs and Lindsay combined. If anyone needed to know what had just happened, it was him. Then Ethan typed the next line, CC board members at bayesianair.com, Nova Site executive team, and 2 contacts from major press outlets, not to threaten, but to create witnesses, to ensure the truth could not be buried. He didn't type fast. Every word fell like a note in a rising, tense melody. When he reached the part describing the incident, his hands paused, not from hesitation, but because he wanted to write accurately, clearly, without exaggeration. He didn't need embellishment. The truth was already enough. At 17:46, I was asked to leave seat 1 Alpha, despite holding a valid ticket. No one checked my ticket. No one reviewed the system data. I was judged by my clothing. I was deemed unworthy of the first-class seat I paid for. I was sent to economy in front of everyone. This was not a mistake. It was the result of bias. With every word he typed, his heart felt lighter in one way and harder in another, as if he were reforging himself into stronger metal. When he reached the part regarding the corporate partnership worth tens of millions of dollars, his eyes sharpened. He knew this wasn't a cheap threat. It was reality. Nova Site could choose any airline. Bayesian Air stood to lose more than anyone in seat 1 Alpha could imagine. He typed the final lines, regards Ethan Reeves, CEO of Nova Site Technologies. When he looked at the send button, he felt his heartbeat slow. It was like drawing a bowstring, tense and heavy but perfectly aimed. He wasn't writing from anger. He wrote with the clarity of someone who understood the weight of every decision. He knew pressing send would create a storm, but it would not be a destructive storm. It would be a cleansing one. Ethan inhaled deeply. His finger moved, and he pressed send. The soft whoosh sounded like a whisper, but to Ethan it echoed like a bullet leaving a chamber irreversible and guaranteed to hit its mark. He closed the laptop, rested it on his lap, and gazed out the window at the dark sky streaming past. In the shadows his eyes were not cold. They held only one thing, a promise. A promise that those who belittled him today would face the consequences, not for his sake, but so they would never do it to anyone else again. And as the plane sliced through the night, Ethan sat still in the chaos of cries, sighs, and the muffled pulse of the economy cabin. No one knew that in that exact moment, a new chapter had begun. Not for Ethan Reeves, but for Bayesian Air. And at the airline's headquarters half a world away, it would take just one person opening that email for everything to fall apart. The BX-914 aircraft sliced through the night sky like a steel arrow, but inside the cabin, time seemed to thicken and slow, as if the entire space was holding its breath around the thoughts of the man in seat 32 Bravo. Ethan Reeves barely moved, barely showed emotion, yet the faint tremor in the center of his palm after pressing send had not faded. It wasn't fear. It wasn't hesitation. It was the awareness that what he had just done, small and enormous at the same time, would trigger a chain reaction that could not be stopped. He didn't know how fast it would happen. He only knew it would. Inevitably. Unavoidably. As the plane pushed through thick layers of dark clouds and the moon disappeared behind them, the only light left was the reflection of the cabin lamps on Ethan's phone screen, gone black. He leaned his head against the seat, listening to the deep hum of the engines, steady and heavy, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. And then, as if tugging him back from the shadows of his own thoughts, a gentle voice rose beside him. "Are you all right?" It was the young flight attendant, the one who had looked at him with genuine kindness when he was forced into economy. Her name tag read Chloe Bennett. She stood slightly bent toward him, a small water bottle in her hand, as if trying to hide her discomfort at witnessing what her colleagues had done. Ethan lifted his gaze and met her warm brown eyes. "I'm fine," he said, although the tiredness in his voice betrayed him. Chloe set the water on his tray table. "I'm sorry for what happened," she whispered low enough that only he could hear. It wasn't right. No one deserves to be treated that way. A simple sentence, yet filled with something Lindsay never had empathy. Ethan gave her a small, grateful smile and nodded. "Thank you. But it's over now." Chloe pressed her lips together, her expression tightening with unease. "No, it isn't." She glanced toward the front of the cabin, her voice dropping into a tense whisper. "Captain Briggs just called down. Lindsay is being summoned to the cockpit. They look really worried." Ethan looked toward the curtain, separating economy from first class, the corner of his mouth lifting faintly. "Is that so?" Chloe nodded quickly. "I don't know what's happening, but I've never seen them panic like this." She wanted to ask more, wanted to understand why a man in a hoodie could send the entire crew into chaos, but something inside her told her not to push. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay. If you need anything, call me." She left before he could answer, walking briskly, as if afraid someone would notice her talking to him too long. Ethan watched her go, a small point of light in a dark sky. Even a single light was enough to keep some faith in humanity. Half a world away inside the black glass headquarters of Bayesian Air in Chicago, the wall clock struck 2:09 in the afternoon. It should have been a quiet moment after lunch before the final meetings of the day, but on the 47th floor inside the office of the Vice President of Corporate Accounts, the air felt like it had been sucked into a hurricane. Mike Holden, 55, grey-haired and with hands that always trembled when he grew anxious, was holding a cup of coffee when his desk phone rang. A normal ring, a normal call, but when he glanced at his email screen and saw the name of the sender in his inbox, the cup didn't just slip. It dropped straight to the floor and shattered across the polished stone tiles. He didn't clean it, didn't apologize to the staff looking at him in shock. He only exhaled one word. "We're finished." His inbox displayed a subject line that felt like a death sentence printed in black on white. Cancellation of $60 million contract due to discrimination on Flight Bravo, X-ray 914. Sent by Ethan Reeves, CEO of Noversight Technologies. CEO, airline CEO, full board of directors, major press outlets. Mike didn't need to read the content. The subject line alone was enough to make the floor feel like it was cracking beneath him. He called the CEO's office directly, without permission, without an assistant, without knocking. "I need Daniel immediately. He's in a meeting. No. Now." His voice was loud enough for half the floor to hear. On the 52nd floor, during a dull meeting about fuel strategy, Daniel Cross, 51, a handsome but perpetually exhausted man, listened to a report about jet fuel pricing. He stifled a yawn, hoping no one noticed. The door slammed open. Mike burst in, breathless, pale, as if he had witnessed a disaster firsthand. He didn't apologize, didn't greet anyone, didn't knock. He held the iPad straight out at Daniel. Daniel, you need to see this. Right now. Daniel frowned, ready to reprimand him. But something in Mike's face, the expression of a strict man completely undone, silenced him. He took the iPad and looked, and his world detonated in complete silence. No one said a word. No one even breathed. Daniel saw the sender, saw the subject line, and saw the name he recognized: Ethan Reeves. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His fingers tightened around the tablet until his knuckles turned white. He shot to his feet, the chair scraping loudly behind him. No. This can't be happening, he whispered. This is catastrophic, a board member asked quietly. Have we lost the contract? Daniel turned toward him, eyes sharp as a surgeon's blade. Not just the contract, our reputation. Then he shouted, Connect me to the cockpit of Bravo, X-ray, 914, immediately. Red level emergency. I want to know exactly what happened. Meanwhile, over the Atlantic Ocean, Captain Briggs sipped coffee in the cockpit, basking in the private triumph of what he believed was a perfectly handled problem passenger. A strange beeping came from the A-car's printer. Briggs frowned and walked over. He tore off the printed message. The capitalized words struck him like a punch. Red alert confirm passenger Ethan Reeves, CEO of Noversight. Provide full incident report immediately. CEO awaiting explanation. Urgent. Briggs froze. The red letters seemed to seep into his eyes, his skin, every cell of his body. He felt like a man standing on the deck of a ship as a tsunami rose before him. Ethan Reeves, he whispered. The man he had pushed into economy, the man he assumed did not belong in. Seat 1 Alpha was the CEO of the company, negotiating a multi-million-dollar partnership with the airline. Sweat crawled down the back of his neck. His hand shook so hard he almost dropped the paper. His brain buzzed like an alarm. He whispered, I'm finished. In first class, Lindsay wasn't doing any better. George, the lead flight attendant, approached her with a face drained of color. Lindsay, the captain wants you. Something big happened? She frowned. What it was, just a problem passenger. George looked at her the way someone looks at a person who has signed their own death sentence without knowing it. That passenger is the CEO of Noversight. Lindsay let out a laugh. You're joking, right? A CEO wearing a cheap hoodie, sitting near economy passengers. But George didn't laugh, didn't blink, didn't move. Every drop of color drained from Lindsay's face. Her stomach clenched so tight she could barely breathe. No, that's impossible. Her lips trembled, her throat dried up. George placed a hand on her shoulder, speaking quietly, heavily. You pushed the wrong person, the worst person you could have chosen, and now the storm is coming straight for us. In seat 32, Bravo Ethan didn't need to know what was unfolding in the front cabin. He couldn't hear the A-cars, couldn't see Briggs turning pale, couldn't see Lindsay shaking like someone who had slipped off a cliff. But he knew. The air had a scent of change. He sensed it with the instinct of someone who had survived more battles than anyone could guess. Ethan opened his eyes and looked into the darkness outside. Thin moonlight filtered through the clouds and brushed across his face, giving his eyes a faint, metallic glow. He smiled softly. Not a joyful smile, not a vengeful smile. It was the smile of someone who knew the truth had finally begun to move back to its rightful place. Rapid footsteps approached down the aisle. Ethan didn't turn. But he already knew who was coming. The universe was shifting, and this time it was shifting toward him. The hurried footsteps echoed from the front of the cabin, sharp and tense, each step hitting the floor like someone carrying a storm already breaking inside them. Passengers in economy looked up, most out of curiosity, but a few recognized Lindsay immediately. The perfectly combed blonde hair, the proud posture from earlier, the stiff smile she wore like a mask. But now none of that remained. Her face was pale as powdered glass, her eyes wide and filled with panic. Every step she took looked like she was balancing on a fraying rope that could snap at any moment. What's wrong with her? Why is she in economy? Something's happening. Whispers rose around her, but Lindsay didn't hear them. Or rather, she couldn't. Every sound in her ears had been drowned out by one single noise, the pounding heartbeat of a woman falling from confidence into sheer terror. She walked straight to row 32, as if walking toward the final line of her own sentence. When she reached it, she stopped. It was as if her legs no longer belonged to her. Ethan Reeves sat there, still calm, still quiet, still in his grey hoodie, still looking like the man she assumed did not have the status to sit in first class. That assumption was the greatest mistake of her life. She inhaled shakily, stood a little straighter, then bent forward in a small bow, as if trying to hide her fear. Mr. Reeves, Ethan opened his eyes and turned his head toward her. In that moment, Lindsay felt completely exposed, stripped of every layer she had used to hide her prejudice. Her voice cracked. We sincerely apologize for what happened earlier. There was a system error. Captain Briggs has asked me to bring you back, to seat 1 Alpha. We are very, very sorry. She stuttered so badly, each word sounded like it was broken in half. Passengers nearby didn't understand what was happening, but the sharp ones noticed something. This voice was nothing like the one she used when she pushed Ethan out of first class. Not even close. Back then it was authority. Now it was fear. Ethan said nothing for a few seconds. He just looked at her. A quiet gaze without anger, without contempt, just the gaze of someone who had already seen through every excuse. Seat 1 Alpha is still waiting for you. Lindsay continued, her voice trembling even harder. Please come back. Ethan leaned back, his fingers interlaced. I assume the captain has read the email, he asked. The question was so soft, it barely counted as sarcasm. Yet, it hit Lindsay like the entire floor gave way beneath her. She nodded weakly. Captain Briggs received an urgent message from headquarters, she whispered, her voice shaking like a guitar string in a strong wind. He is very alarmed. He wants to fix this immediately. Ethan's lips curved slightly. Not a smile, but the expression of someone hearing the truth far too late. 2 hours too late, he said. Lindsay froze completely. She wanted to say something, to explain, to ask for forgiveness, but her throat tightened until no words could escape. Ethan's silence, calm and light, was sharper than any anger she could have faced. Finally, she managed to force out a broken sentence. We sincerely apologize. For everything. Ethan turned back toward the window, no longer looking at her. The apology is not the problem, he said, his voice steady and cold. The problem is the way you treat your own passengers. Lindsay had a no reply. She nodded, then stepped away from row 32, like a fading shadow. No pride left. No sharp stare, no forced smile. Only fear and regret. Inside the cockpit, Captain Briggs leaned against the wall, sweat gathering at his temples. His hand clutched the armrest of the pilot's chair, trembling too hard to hide. On the floor lay the ACARS printout, its red warning lines like splashes of blood. "My God, what have I done?" he whispered, voice hoarse. He looked through the slightly open cockpit door and saw Lindsay return, wearing the expression of someone suffocating in dread. George, the lead flight attendant, looked at Briggs and let out a long, heavy breath. "You know he's the customer our company has been trying to secure for the biggest corporate contract we've ever pursued." Briggs closed his eyes, gripping the chair until his knuckles turned white. I didn't know," he said. "I should have checked the ticket. I should have checked everything." George's eyes were a mix of pity and disappointment. "No, Howard. You should have checked your own bias." The words hit Briggs like a hammer to the chest. Back in economy, whispers spread like ripples. Chloe walked by, trying to keep her face neutral, yet she couldn't stop her eyes from drifting toward the end of the cabin where Ethan sat. Passengers murmured. Why did the attendant apologize to him? Why did the captain call his name? Who is he? Ethan heard every question, but he didn't answer. He didn't need to. He wasn't boiling with anger. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel satisfaction at seeing those who wronged him panic. He felt only one thing. This never should have happened in the first place. He didn't ask to be treated like royalty. He just wanted to be treated like a human being. 10 minutes later, George arrived in person. Unlike Lindsay, he did not tremble. He didn't bow too deeply. He didn't stutter. George was the kind of man who knew that respect came from attitude, not fear. He bowed his head slightly. "Mr. Reeves, on behalf of the entire crew, I sincerely apologize." Ethan looked at him silently. "I will not make excuses," George continued. "I will not blame the system. I will only say the truth. We were wrong, and severely so." A moment of silence stretched across the plane. Even passengers chewing snacks paused. George went on. "Captain Briggs wishes to speak with you after we land. But I know that is not enough. If you need anything at all for the rest of this flight, I will take care of it personally." Ethan shook his head. "I don't need anything. I'm fine." George nodded respectfully. "Then with your permission, we would like to return you to your seat." Ethan met his eyes. "Respect is not something you give back with a seat." George bowed again, then stepped aside. "Understood. I will be nearby if you change your mind." Briggs received the update through the intercom. His eyes shut, his chest tightening. He knew that the moment Ethan said no control had shifted into a chapter he no longer had authority over. He whispered to himself, "We chose the wrong man," in the worst possible way. The Boeing continued across the European sky, but in first class, unease spread like fog. Richard Bowman still sat there, ready to flaunt his privilege, unaware of the storm racing toward him faster than light. And Ethan, he leaned back, closed his eyes, letting his breath settle. No one knew what he was thinking, but if anyone looked closely enough, they'd see something in his expression. Not anger, not sadness, not fear, but the terrifying calm of a man who knows he holds the blade, and very soon those who underestimated him will learn exactly how sharp it is. The air inside BX 914 suddenly grew so thick, Ethan could almost feel the dust particles hanging motionless. A few passengers pulled their necks in as Lindsay hurried down the aisle, face drained of all color. Others pretended to focus on their movies, but their eyes kept drifting toward row 32, as if pulled by an invisible force. Under the soft yellow cabin lights, the entire economy section had become an unintended stage, every gaze drawn toward the man in a grey hoodie, the man whose single email had shaken the power structure of first class. Ethan sat with his eyes half closed, looking like he was resting, but every sense in him was alert and sharp. He could feel Lindsay's frantic heartbeat as she retreated toward the front, hear the heavy footfalls of George as he spoke with the crew, and even sense the strained breaths of Captain Harold Briggs behind the sealed cockpit door, the sound of a man whose authority was crumbling. Ethan had once believed discrimination always announced itself loudly, a visible act, something anyone could notice. But tonight he realized it was more like the electricity running behind the walls. No one sees it. No one hears it. But when it shorts, the entire building can burn. Chloe, the young attendant, passed by and placed a small packet of tissues on his tray table. Not because he was crying, but because she wanted to do something, anything, to restore a bit of humanity in a world built on polished facades. Her eyes met his, for one brief second, filled with shame on behalf of her colleagues. Ethan nodded in thanks. The whole economy cabin seemed to be silently rooting for him, though no one said a word. It was the silence of shared experience, the silence of people who had seen prejudice, endured it, or felt powerless against it. But tonight they had a witness. They had a voice. And they knew the truth would not be buried this time. From the front of the plane, the cockpit door opened again. George stepped out, his face carrying a solemn heaviness. He whispered something to Lindsay, who looked like she could barely stand. After a short exchange, Lindsay clenched her fists and took a deep breath like someone preparing to leave the final courtroom. The aircraft was so quiet, Ethan heard the tiny gasp in her throat as she began another round of passenger checks. But now she was no longer the one controlling the space. She was the one being swallowed by it. Lindsay's fear spread like the faint scent of smoke in a small room, subtle but unmistakable. Every passenger felt it, even if they didn't know why. Those who ignored Ethan earlier now watched Lindsay with a new expression, the expression of someone who refuses to miss the next twist in a story. In first class, Richard Bowman still sat smugly in seat 1 Alpha, reclining as though the chair belonged to his lineage. But when Lindsay leaned in and whispered to him, something in his face snapped. His eyes narrowed. His confidence flickered. He looked around, noticing for the first time the tense faces of the crew, the stiff posture of George, the heavy atmosphere settling over first class. Something enormous was unfolding. He struggled to understand, but Lindsay only shook her head, lips trembling. "We chose the wrong person." Richard blinked. "What do you mean? He's a CEO, Lindsay." Whispered voice, barely audible, "the one our airline has been trying to sign." Richard jerked upright as if struck by electricity. Impossible. That man in that hoodie. Lindsay lowered her eyes like a child caught misbehaving. Richard swallowed hard. The seat beneath him suddenly felt sharp and scorching. "Oh God," he murmured. In economy, Ethan opened his eyes. He couldn't see the scene, but he felt it. He recognized the moment arrogance transforms into panic. It sounded like thin metal being bent soft but cutting. Richard Bowman was hearing that sound now. Ethan turned slightly toward the aisle where Lindsay had disappeared. He didn't want revenge. He wanted the truth put where it belonged. And if those with power refused to see the truth unless cornered, then tonight the corner had been built. A soft beeping came from the front of the plane. George stepped forward, holding the intercom. His face was grave, his eyes steady with the resolve of someone fulfilling a necessary duty. "Ladies and gentlemen." The entire cabin fell silent. "We have received instructions from headquarters in Chicago." Every eye turned toward him. Inside the cockpit, Captain Briggs sat motionless, his hand pressed to his forehead. He didn't dare look out, didn't dare listen, but he knew he would face everything once they landed. George continued his voice, calm but firm. Some members of the flight crew will be required to remain on board after landing to cooperate with an internal investigation. A wave of murmurs spread instantly. Passengers looked around. What did they do wrong? Did someone file a complaint? Ethan stayed completely still, fingers woven together, gaze forward. George went on. We ask for your cooperation and apologize for any inconvenience. No one understood the full truth, but the energy in the plane shifted completely. First class fell into fearful silence. Richard's smile vanished entirely. His face turned pale, as if someone had drained every drop of color. Chloe placed a can of water on Ethan's tray, her voice soft. Are they going to do something to you? No, Ethan answered quietly. They're doing it to themselves. She didn't understand the meaning, but the calmness in his voice made her shiver. Calm like someone who knew the sky was about to change color. The plane began its descent. The light outside shifted as they approached Zurich airspace clouds, parting under the wings like torn sheets. The pilot announced, "Prepare for landing." In first class, Richard stood to grab his coat. Lindsay rushed over. "Mr. Bowman, please sit down. You must remain seated until we receive clearance." He snapped, "Why, I am a Platinum member." George's voice cut through like a blade. "Mr. Bowman, sit down. This is not a request. This is an order." For the first time in years, Richard felt stripped of priority. No special treatment, no favored status. His power meant nothing. He saw Lindsay trembling, and he finally understood how serious the situation was. The plane touched down. One soft jolt. But it was enough to wake every buried emotion in the cabin. The seatbelt sign had not even turned off when the aircraft door opened immediately, something that only happened under special directives. A man stepped into first class, not a flight attendant, not airport security, but someone every crew member recognized. Michael Lawson, Vice President of European Operations for Bayesian Air. Black suit, grey silk tie, eyes cold as winter lake water. He entered the plane like a man carrying a verdict. Passengers sensed the tension and fell silent. Michael did not stop in first class, did not look at Richard, did not acknowledge Lindsay. He walked straight ahead, straight into economy, straight toward row 32, straight to Ethan. Ethan lifted his head, not surprised, not intimidated, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Michael stopped in front of him, bowed slightly, and spoke in a voice low and heavy with respect. "Mr. Reeves, I am Michael Lawson, Regional Representative for Bayesian Air in Europe." He swallowed the shame rising in him. "On behalf of the entire airline, please accept our deepest apologies. We have failed, completely failed." The entire cabin went silent. "If you will allow it," Michael said, "we will escort you off the aircraft first. A car is waiting for you on the tarmac." Ethan rose slowly. Everyone stepped aside. In that moment, they understood the truth. The man in the hoodie was no ordinary passenger, not someone humiliated, but someone holding the power to change the fate of an entire airline. Ethan said nothing to Richard as he passed. The man looked hollow, emptied. He said nothing to Lindsay either. She had nearly collapsed in her seat, eyes empty, knowing her career was over. Ethan simply walked toward the open aircraft door, where Zurich's cold light poured in like a new chapter waiting. A chapter that would teach everyone one thing: power does not come from the seat you are given. Power comes from how you rise after being pushed out of it. A cold draft from the pressurized air system swept into the cabin of BX 914 as the aircraft door opened, carrying with it the smell of metal, damp earth, and the quiet unfamiliarity of a foreign land. Zurich greeted them with pale morning light, a light so cold it made every breath visible, And in that silver glow, the shadow of Michael Lawson, the highest regional authority for Bayesian air in Europe, stretched across the cabin floor like a full stop at the end of the order that had existed on this flight. Ethan stepped toward the aircraft door backpack, hanging loosely over one shoulder. No luxury coat, no gleaming suitcase, no assistant. Just him, a man in a grey hoodie who looked as if he had stepped out of a college coffee shop. But the moment he placed a foot on the jet bridge carpet, everyone nearby felt something shift. Not because of the way he walked, because of the way the air shifted around him, as though the world had suddenly realized it had misjudged him. Michael walked beside him, back, straight hands, clasped loosely in front of him, a posture not of authority, but of respect. "We have arranged a vehicle for you at Private Bay, Bravo 17. The hotel is also prepared." He could have offered excuses, blamed procedures, or tried to soften the situation, but his eyes said he knew the truth. No explanation mattered. Bayesian air had made a mistake that could not be justified, and Ethan was the one man they could not afford to wrong. Ethan did not answer right away. He glanced through the glass wall into the terminal where crowds of passengers lined up for passport control. They murmured some pointed back toward the aircraft. Some stretched their necks to catch a glimpse of him. None of them knew who he was, but the tension in the air told them the man in the hoodie was not an ordinary traveler. Michael swallowed hard. "We will take full responsibility. The entire crew will remain for the investigation. Captain Briggs and Miss Carter, they will not leave the aircraft until everything is clear." His final words were so quiet, it felt as if saying them aloud would collapse the jet bridge itself. Ethan tilted his head slightly, a subtle sign that told Michael he was listening. Behind them in first class, Richard Bowman had stood when Ethan passed him earlier. But now he remained frozen, unable to move. Through the curtain, he saw Ethan leaving, flanked by senior airline officials, and he did not call out. He did not dare, partly from shame, partly from the shock of realizing that in the moment he believed he held the highest power on board, he was actually the least significant person there. Richard's gaze shifted to Lindsay, collapsed in a passenger seat near the door, her hands covering her face. She trembled like someone cold on the outside, but burning on the inside. The woman who acted with the authority of a queen of the cabin was now just an employee whose badge would likely be stripped, whose career would be questioned, whose actions would become a cautionary tale in future ethics training. George stood beside her, releasing a long, heavy sigh. He had seen many things in his career, but this was bigger than anything he had ever witnessed. As Ethan stepped onto the jet bridge, the bluish-white LED lights reflected in his eyes. Michael spoke again. "A car is waiting for you. It will take you directly to your hotel." And Ethan paused mid-step. "No need to drive me," he said, his voice low but firm enough to stop Michael cold. "You mean?" "I can walk, and I want a moment of quiet." Michael stiffened. Nothing in his crisis script prepared him for that. "Of course, but your luggage and the official reception, I don't need a reception. I am not here to be treated specially. I need your company." Ethan glanced toward the aircraft door where Briggs and Lindsay still hadn't dared step out to learn the lesson they should have learned long before today. Michael bowed his head. "We will learn it. I promise you." Ethan gave him a small nod, the smallest gesture of respect for someone who knew how to accept accountability. Then he stepped down the ramp. The Zurich wind sliced through the thin fabric of his hoodie, making him shiver slightly. But the cold was welcome. It peeled away the heaviness of the flight, grounding him again. At the end of the jet bridge, a polished black sedan waited. The driver in a tailored vest opened the door, bowing. "Mr. Reeves, your car is ready." "Thank you. I'm walking," Ethan replied. The driver blinked in confusion. Michael almost stepped forward to intervene. "Sir, it is quite cold, and I need a few minutes," Ethan said, quiet but absolute. Michael fell silent. He understood. A man who had been forced out of the seat he paid for, treated as someone who did not belong, did not need champagne or VIP service. He needed space. Space to stand. Space to breathe. Space to soothe the wound no one else could see. Ethan stepped onto the tarmac, hands in his hoodie pockets, his breath turning into faint white clouds. He looked up toward the sky where BX 914 had just descended, and felt the sting of Zurich's winter morning brush against his face. The cold cleared his mind, pulling him back to his purpose, the upcoming meeting with Westalion. His phone vibrated. Rachel was video calling. He answered. "Just landed," he said. Rachel sighed, but fire sharpened in her eyes. "Are you all right?" "I am. How's everyone back at the company?" "They read your email." They froze. "Everyone is furious for you. And proud." Ethan smiled, truly smiled for the first time in hours. "We'll talk later. I need to focus on the deal." Rachel nodded with conviction. "You're going to win. Like always." The call ended. A moment later, Ethan got into the car. The ride to the hotel was silent, except for the warm hum of the heater and the faint exhale of classical music drifting through the speakers. But his mind was racing, not because of the humiliation he endured, but because of what it represented. People like Lindsay, like Briggs, like Richard Bowman existed everywhere, in every company, every system, every ladder of power. And they were not always villains. They were simply people taught by society to judge first and see truth later. The problem was they believed their judgment was correct, and that belief, unchecked, could become a weapon. Ethan looked out the window at Zurich's old stone buildings, gliding past like pages in an ancient book, each one whispering about order structure, right and wrong. He thought of the people still being questioned on board. He felt no satisfaction, no hatred. Only this. If they are not forced to confront the truth, they will do this again. And the next person may not have the power to send an email to a CEO. That was the real issue. The car stopped before the hotel, a grand structure of white stone, towering over Lake Zurich like a castle. The revolving doors opened, and staff bowed respectfully. "We have prepared the presidential suite for you," the manager said. Ethan nodded. He didn't need a presidential suite, but he understood this was part of their atonement. And if it helped push Bayesian air toward real change, he could accept it. When the suite door opened, Ethan stepped into a quiet space. High ceilings, warm golden lights, and huge windows overlooking the lake. But his eyes were not drawn to the bed, the luxurious furniture, the fresh flowers, or the champagne waiting on the table. They were drawn to a single envelope placed in the center of the room. Thick weighted, sealed with red wax stamped with the Bayesian air emblem. Ethan walked over and opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter from CEO Daniel Cross, written in ink, not printed, not pre-drafted, each stroke slightly uneven, as if written in urgency but sincerity. "I have no words to justify what happened. We failed to see you as you are, and we failed to treat you as the human being you deserve to be." Ethan read on. "If you allow it, I want to do one thing, make this right. Not with promises, with action. At the end of the letter, I hope to meet you tonight. Not to save the contract, but to have the chance to learn from our mistake." Ethan folded the letter and placed it on the table. He stood at the window overlooking the lake, the cold wind pushing against the glass like a winter hand. Then he closed his eyes. In that moment, Ethan knew a larger battle began here. Not a battle against the airline. A battle to force an entire system to change. And he, a man in a hoodie who had been pushed out of seat 1 Alpha, would be the one to lay the first stone. As the aircraft descended toward the Zurich runway, under a wash of golden twilight, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. No one said a word, but every gaze drifted toward an invisible point in the back of economy, where Ethan sat. For 8 hours, first class had been a world of laughter, champagne, and entitlement, while economy, where Ethan had been forced to sit, was a world of silence, cramped seats, and the kind of humiliation that cut down to the bone. But in that worst seat on the plane, a quiet storm had formed, and now it was rushing straight toward the people who ignited it. Just minutes before landing, the young flight attendant, Chloe, the only one who had shown Ethan kindness, stood at the front of economy and looked at him with a mix of worry and respect. She knew what was happening. The entire crew knew. Internal messages sent in panic, frantic calls from the cockpit, hushed whispers in the galley, all leading to one irreversible truth: the man thrown out of first class was not merely a platinum passenger, not just a businessman, but Ethan Ward, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, and the man preparing to sign the contract the airline had pinned its future on. Ethan felt the stares following him, some curious, some frightened, some carrying sympathy for those foolish enough to cross him. But he stayed still, head leaned back, hand resting lightly on his laptop bag. His anger was gone. In its place was the chilling calm of someone who had already triggered a bomb and was simply waiting for the echo. When the wheels touched the runway with a light tremor, the seatbelt chime rang, but no one moved. Every pair of eyes turned toward the front of the aircraft, just as the cockpit door opened. Purser George stepped out, wearing the expression of a man announcing a state of emergency. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." His voice was as firm as a verdict. Captain James Porter and lead flight attendant Lindsay Cole are required to stay on board and are not permitted to leave their positions. The cabin erupted into hushed murmurs. Some passengers covered their mouths. It felt like a courtroom, and they were unwilling witnesses. Up front, Lindsay, who had looked at Ethan with pure disdain earlier, had gone completely pale. She tried to hide behind the galley door, but there was no escaping to the stairs. Captain Porter's face was stretched tight. His tired, weathered eyes, shaped by thousands of hours in the sky, were now filled with the fear of a man who knew a single mistake could destroy an entire career. And today, he had made the worst mistake of his life. A sharp click sounded from the aircraft door. The jet bridge had just connected. But instead of the usual ground staff, a man in a charcoal grey suit walked aboard, with a powerful posture and a cold gaze. Some passengers recognized him immediately. Jonathan Hale, Vice President of European Operations for the airline. He did not stop in first class. He did not greet wealthy passengers. He did not shake hands with frequent flyers. Instead, he walked straight down to row 34 where Ethan sat. The aircraft became suffocatingly silent. When Jonathan stopped beside 34 Bravo, he bowed slightly, as if addressing a head of state. "Mr. Ward, on behalf of the CEO, the Executive Board, and the entire organization, I sincerely apologize for what occurred today." Ethan rose slowly, unhurried. His expression held no anger, only a quietness that made others instinctively lower their eyes. Jonathan swallowed. "Please allow us to escort you off the aircraft first. A private car is waiting to take you to the hotel. All arrangements have been handled, and we will comply fully with any decision you choose to make." Ethan did not reply. He simply took his laptop and stepped into the aisle. A path opened before him, not because people stepped aside, but because no one dared to stand. As he passed each row, some passengers nodded respectfully. A woman whispered, "That's the CIO of Ward Technology, my God." A man beside her muttered, "They chose the worst possible person to insult." Ethan ignored them. He only wanted to leave the plane that had become a chamber of humiliation. Until he reached first class. Lindsay stood, frozen, face ashen, fingers clenched so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She tried to smile, but her lips trembled violently. Captain Porter stood beside her, shoulders collapsed, wearing the expression of a man who had just read his own farewell letter. Jonathan stepped forward, his voice slicing through the air. "Captain Porter." "Miss Cole, you are both suspended from duty, effective immediately. Your employee badges will be confiscated as you exit the aircraft. A human resources team is waiting at the jet bridge to begin the investigation." Lindsay nearly collapsed. Captain Porter closed his eyes as if everything had fallen apart at once. But Jonathan was not finished. He turned to Ethan. "Mr. Ward, any directive you wish to give regarding further action will be executed." Ethan looked at them, at the two people who had once treated him like trash based on a single glance, and who now stood trembling before him. But he did not raise his voice. He did not gloat. He offered only one sentence, cold and sharp as steel. "All I ask is that the truth is documented fully. No sugarcoating, no cover-up, no repetition." No one answered. They all understood that meant the entire system would be exposed. Ethan walked past them, leaving first class, not as the humiliated man he had been hours earlier, but as someone holding absolute power. As he stepped onto the glass jet bridge, dozens of airport staff and two senior managers bowed to welcome him. A luxury car waited outside, not the usual VIP transport, but the kind reserved for diplomatic officials. Ethan entered the car, closed the door, and let the silence swallow the noise outside, and in that moment, caught between the remnants of anger and the calm of someone who had stood before 1,000 boardrooms, he realized something. The distance between a CEO and an ordinary man can sometimes be as thin as a hoodie. But the distance between a decent person and someone who discriminates is so deep that no airline in the world can hide it. His trip to Zurich was far from over, but the first storm had passed, and far ahead, something even bigger was waiting. The night sky outside the glass meeting room of the Zurich hotel was perfectly still, yet inside, the air was so tense that a single breath could have shattered it. Ethan sat with his back resting lightly against the chair at the head of the table, a fountain pen turning between his fingers like a sharpened blade, hovering in the silent room. In front of him, 3 grown men, Robert Finch and the company's lead legal counsel, sat rigidly in their seats, like students caught cheating in an exam. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Ethan watched them for a long moment, his amber eyes deep enough to see straight through bone and marrow. He was not angry. He did not raise his voice, and that calm was exactly what made all 3 of them tremble even more. "We agreed on the terms," Ethan said, his voice low and deliberate, each word hitting the air like a knock on the door of fate. "Now I want to hear it from your own mouths. Who will take responsibility in front of the media?" Finch swallowed hard, his throat tightening. Robert, the man who oversaw an entire global airline conglomerate, could not hide how shaken he was. "I will," Robert finally said, his voice hoarse. "I will take full public responsibility. No excuses, no deflection, no hiding." Good, Ethan answered, placing the pen on the table with a soft tap that echoed like a hammer striking metal. But let me remind you, this is not about saving a brand. This is about atonement. No one objected, because they all understood that this had gone far beyond business. This was a moral judgment. When the meeting ended, the three men walked out, looking as if they had just survived a Category 12 storm. Ethan remained alone in the vast room, warm golden light reflecting off his calm face. He leaned back, eyes tracing the intricate lines of the Swiss ceiling above him, cold and perfect in its design. A faint smile touched his lips. Not the smile of someone who won, but of someone who finally reclaimed the justice that should have been his from the beginning. His phone buzzed. An internal company email lit up the screen. Apex Air has officially triggered an emergency corporate culture revalidation initiative. Priority anti-discrimination protocols. A small line of text, but its weight could redirect thousands of people. Ethan exhaled slowly the first real breath in nearly 48 hours that did not carry the heaviness of resentment. The next morning, the von Steiner AG headquarters stood like a glass fortress in the heart of Zurich. Ethan walked in with a quiet confidence, no longer the man forced out of first class because of a grey hoodie. Today, he was the CEO, the negotiator, the man who set the terms instead of receiving them. His presentation lasted nearly an hour and not a single person looked away. Each slide landed like the footsteps of a warrior, strong, precise, leaving no wasted breath. When he finished, the room fell into stunned silence before rising in applause. The contract was signed beneath a massive crystal pane, the emerald surface of Lake Zurich shimmering in the background. The future of a new technology partnership opened wide, and Ethan knew that part of this victory was born from the humiliation of that day, from the moment he was pushed out of seat 1 Alpha simply because they could not see the worth of the man wearing that hoodie. 2 days later, on the flight back to New York, a different airline, a different service, a different way of seeing. Ethan sat in a private first suite, a small enclosed sanctuary of warm lighting and crystal wine glasses. He opened his iPad and watched the social feeds explode. Apex Air announces largest corporate reform in history following discrimination scandal involving a first-class passenger. CEO issues public apology and pledges $5 million to black education initiatives. 2 crew members terminated. His name, nowhere. Ethan stared at the headlines, then quietly closed the iPad. His gaze drifted toward the window where layers of clouds floated like soft wool. Not triumph, not revenge, just peace, the peace of someone who had placed the first stone on a road far longer than the world would ever see. A young captain passed the suite, glanced in and paused. He bowed his head slightly. "Wishing you an excellent flight, sir." Not because Ethan was black, not because he wore a hoodie, not because he had money, but because he was respected as a human being. As the aircraft crossed the Atlantic, Ethan slowly closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw himself standing in that airplane, cabin judged dismissed, treated as if he did not belong. He whispered to himself, "Real power does not come from the seat you occupy. It comes from the way you force the world to change." In that moment, the sky stretched endlessly beneath him, and Ethan understood one thing: the fight for fairness did not end with an email or a seat in first class. It had only just begun. From the perspective of an expert in organizational culture and human behavior, Ethan Ward's story reveals a truth that many power structures often choose to overlook. Discrimination does not always appear as blatant acts. Sometimes it begins with a single glance, an assumption, and an irresponsible decision. But what makes this story remarkable is not the fall Ethan had to endure, but the way he chose to rise again with calm, with intellect, and with the ability to force a massive organization to confront its own failures. Ethan did not use anger to strike back. He used his power to create change. And that is the difference between revenge and responsibility, between conflict and progress. When an individual dares to hold on to their dignity in their darkest moment, they do not only change their own fate, they change how a system treats those who come after. If this story speaks to you, please like the video to help spread the message of fairness, and subscribe to follow more powerful journeys that expose prejudice. And leave a comment with the phrase, "Respect first," to remind each other that all change begins with that simple truth.